We all carry an image of the Viking, a horned helmet caricature aside, a fierce sea-born warrior who struck quickly, took what he could, and sailed away. But the more we listen to the earth, the bones, the soil chemistry, the patterns in old town plans, the clearer it becomes that some of what followed a monastery raid was not mere opportunistic violence. It was a set of systematic practices that reduced consecrated women to commodities, that removed them not only from life as they knew it, but from the possibility of telling their own story. The question the title forces on us is blunt. What happened to Christian virgins taken in raids, and why might certain ritualized practices inflicted upon them be called, with careful qualification, worse than death? The written chronicles are striking in what they do and do not tell us. Annals record the burning of churches, the slaughter of defenders, lists of treasure taken. They tell us names of kings who fought and places the raiders touched. They seldom describe the fates of the women who vanished in the aftermath. For that silence we must turn to a very different kind of witness, the archaeological record. Bones, shackles, the layout of warehouses, chemical traces in grave fills, isotopic signatures in tooth enamel. These are the fragments of testimony that speak where ink is silent. They do not give us a neat narrative of motive or ritual, and they rarely provide the names of the women whose lives were interrupted. But together they reveal patterns that point toward organized capture, storage, transport, sale, and, in some cases, methods of killing and erasure that went beyond battlefield death. If you value documented, evidence-focused history, subscribe. This channel helps fund careful research and brings these recovered voices into the light. In coastal trading centers such as Dublin, the archaeological picture is unambiguous about the scale and routinization of human commerce. Excavations in what became the Norse quarters reveal shackles and ankle rings designed to restrain living people rather than to mark ownership alone. Foundations of timber warehouses and sequences of repeated floor repairs suggest storage spaces large enough to hold persons in transit. In some strata, small lead tokens, or objects interpreted by some specialists as price markers, appear alongside weights and scales, the same assemblage associated with other types of commercial exchange. Runic or graffiti inscriptions sometimes note transactions or numbers. The interpretation of particular markings remains contested, but taken together, the material culture is consistent with a sustained market in human beings. That market did not terminate at the Irish Sea. Documentary traces and archaeological parallels point to far-reaching networks, ships departing the British Isles to ports in the North Sea, the Baltic trading hub of Hedeby, name verified as Hedeby, and further still through Rus's towns such as Novgorod and Kiev to Constantinople. From there, documented routes connected the Black Sea and Mediterranean trade networks, and some historical sources record the presence of northern slaves in markets as far afield as the Islamic caliphates. The mobility of captives explains why isotope and genetic studies in Scandinavian cemeteries show a notable female line contribution from Britain and Ireland. Women who, for reasons of capture rather than migration, were relocated and integrated into northern households and, in some cases, burial assemblages. The Dublin evidence makes a point about process. This is not merely the chaos of a one-night sack. The archaeological strata indicate repeated episodes of storage, packing, and movement. Small pens and corral-like features, temporary posts driven into compacted earth, and remnants of portable enclosures suggest people were held in place before shipment. Ships described in sagas and seen in timbers uncovered at harbor sites sometimes show modifications, higher rails, reinforced frames, that would make them more suitable for transporting living cargo. Taken together with documentary references to tariffs and tribute that sometimes included human payments, a picture emerges of enslavement as a commercialized, organized activity rather than an occasional byproduct of war. The chronicle silence grows louder in monastery contexts. Consider the case often cited in scholarship, a major inland monastic center raided in the mid-9th century, commonly dated to around the 840s, date to be verified, hereafter given as c. 845, pending confirmation. Contemporary annals note the slaughter of monks and the taking of cattle and treasure, but they are largely silent on the women, nuns, who would have been present in many such houses. Archaeology across a range of sites fills that silence in troubling ways. In some coastal and riverine deposits, archaeologists have found grave contexts and pit deposits with trauma patterns that do not match battlefield injuries. There are cases of perimortem fractures concentrated around the neck and skull, but other profiles are consistent with immobilization, binding, and deliberate killing methods rather than incidental combat. At bog and wetland sites, settings where preservation of organic material is often excellent, burials show additional ambiguity. Some bodies were deposited in shallow pits with limited grave goods, as if committed to hurried disposal. Other deposits show evidence of substances in the surrounding peat that laboratory analysis identifies as plant alkaloids, for example, compounds associated with henbane and certain other narcotics, and, in a smaller number of cases, chemical residues consistent with heavy metals such as mercury. The presence of such compounds in burial environs is interpretatively fraught. Contamination from later activity is always a possibility, and the mere detection of a substance does not prove deliberate poisoning. However, where context, stratigraphy, and associated artifacts align, some scholars infer episodes of drugging, used either to incapacitate captives during transport or, in darker interpretations, to subdue victims prior to ritualized killing. These inferences should be treated as provisional. They indicate possible methods of subjugation that archaeologists and forensic chemists are still untangling. Other inland sites produce complementary data. At several fortified monasteries and town centers, sites in what is today eastern England and central Ireland, excavations uncovered pits whose form and fill suggest rapid interment of multiple individuals. These pits are deep yet narrow. Their placement near defensive works or within cleared courtyards points away from formal funerary practice. In some cases, skeletal remains within these pits show disarticulation or breakage patterns, implying constrained movement at or shortly after death. Again, we must be careful. Mass burial may follow an epidemic, an execution after trial, or the aftermath of military action. Where the anatomical and environmental evidence indicates that limbs were broken in ways designed to prevent escape, and where associated artifacts suggest a connection to captive holding facilities, the pattern supports an interpretation of deliberate, organized deprivation of life and freedom. Repton and York stand out in northern England as sites where archaeology and bioarchaeology combine to reveal the long footprint of Viking presence. At Repton, mass graves have been associated with a wintering army. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel has demonstrated that a number of buried individuals were of non-local origin, some plausibly from the British Isles. At York, Jorvik, urban excavations unearthed areas of repetitive enclosure, possible holding cells, and human remains that, when analyzed, indicate a mix of local and non-local origins, including, in some cases, women whose childhood diet and geological signatures point to upbringing in Western Britain or Ireland. The layout of certain cell-like structures, small confined spaces adjacent to areas interpreted as marketplaces, has been read by some archaeologists as evidence of purpose-built confinement for human trade. This interpretation is contested and must be presented as a plausible, not definitive reading of these architectural traces. Interpreting these practices requires that we understand the legal and cultural fabrics that could make such exploitation socially and economically legible at the time. Icelandic law codes, collected in what is known as gragas, contain provisions that treat captives, and, in particular, female captives, as objects of property claims in ways that would be by modern standards morally abhorrent. Passages in Old Norse legal compilations and later Scandinavian law books regulate the transfer of captives, adjudicate disputes over claims, and outline the rights of owners to their human property. To be clear, the application of these laws varied by time and place, and not every raider or community observed them uniformly. But their existence matters because it shows that certain societies had legal frameworks that normalized ownership and exchange of persons, which in turn provided structural cover for sexual exploitation, forced unions, and the incorporation of captive offspring into local households. We should not forget that this was commerce. Ships, wheeled carts, and port infrastructures attested archaeologically were adapted to move bodies as well as goods. Portable pens, temporary corrals that could be erected in harbor stretches, appear in multiple coastal sites and are archaeologically visible as post-hole patterns and compacted surfaces. Periodic soldierly lists and certain urban ledgers record payments and duties that scholars have argued were, in some instances, levied on human cargo. The economy of slavery in Viking networks was not a marginal curiosity. It interlaced with legitimate merchandise, furs, walrus ivory, silver, and with taxation and tribute systems. When an abbey's valuables were inventoried by a raiding party, women were often part of the inventory that followed in less public documents, and crucially, in the physical traces left in ports and markets. Among the most disturbing interpretations advanced by some historians and archaeologists are practices that appear designed to erase witness and lineage rather than merely to exploit labor or sex. The phrase, worse than death, is not meant as rhetorical flourish here, but as a specific moral claim. Death ends a person's agency and experience. Certain practices had the additional intent, or the practical effect, of erasing identity, testimony, and memory. Two clusters of behavior stand out in this regard. First, deliberate killing methods intended to anonymize victims, execution pits, mass interments without rites, and depositions in places unlikely to be revisited, where pit profiles and associated limb breakage suggest victims were immobilized and buried without ceremony. The result is a double erasure, life extinguished and the traces of that life deliberately hidden or diminished. In several cases, the way bodies were deposited, sometimes stripped of personal items, sometimes bound, makes it impossible for communities to later claim or commemorate them properly. For women who had taken religious vows, this was also an erasure of sanctified identity. Their removal from ritual contexts meant the loss of the social and spiritual markers that testified to their personhood. Second, practices aimed at the obliteration of social lineage, forced unions, and the trafficking of women into households where their children would be raised under the captor's identity. Some baptismal registers and later parish records show the presence of children born to women of northern origin who were recorded as belonging to local households. In several urban contexts, high infant mortality rates clustered in quarters associated with slave-holding households. While high infant mortality has multiple possible causes in the medieval period, the correlation with captive presence and documentary indications of rapid, unregulated baptisms supports a reading in which some offspring of captives were integrated into the captor population with limited recognition of maternal lineage. The deliberate separation of mothers from their kin, the imposition of servile status upon offspring, and the lack of mechanisms for redress all amount to forms of social annihilation that coexist with and in some respects surpass the immediate harm of violence. Some scholars go further and posit the existence of systematic breeding practices, facilities or circumstances in which captives were retained specifically to produce offspring for future labor or sale. This is one of the most contentious claims in the literature and is far from universally accepted. The archaeological signatures invoked in support of it, clusters of female burials with infant remains, stable isotope patterns hinting at repeated presence of women of non-local origin, and textual references to the transfer of children and women in inventories are suggestive but not conclusive. We must therefore present such claims as hypotheses that fit certain patterns of evidence, not as proven institutional policies. When we do speak of breeding as an inferred practice, we must pair it with caution and insist on further research and corroboration. Chemical traces found in certain burial contexts, substances consistent with plant narcotics, and, in a handful of cases with mercury, have also led to uncomfortable but important hypotheses about methods of subjugation or elimination. Mercury, for example, was used in various medieval contexts for medicinal and artisanal purposes, which complicates any simple reading of its presence as evidence of poisoning. Yet where mercury residues are concentrated in association with other markers of captive holding, and where documentary evidence suggests murder or ritual killing, some archaeologists argue that such toxicants may have been used intentionally to incapacitate or to develop long-term pathologies in victims. These interpretations are necessarily tentative. Chemically detecting a substance does not tell us motive or method without robust contextual evidence. What these findings do show is that the bodies we excavate sometimes carry traces of chemical histories that intersect with patterns of coercion and death, demanding multidisciplinary inquiry rather than quick conclusions. All this occurred within social worlds that were also religious and institutional. Christian communities reacted to raids in complex ways. There is evidence in some church records of attempts to recover captives, pay ransoms, or negotiate with local power brokers for release. At the same time, the church as an institution was embedded in the same economic networks that structured medieval life. There are instances where ecclesiastical figures became intermediaries in arranging baptisms for children of mixed origin, or where parish rolls recorded the presence of individuals who had earlier been captives. Such records open painful questions about complicity by omission, when the urgency of survival or the structures of patronage led institutions to absorb and administer people who had been taken as property. Again, we must avoid blanket moralization. Individual acts of rescue and compassion occurred alongside institutional accommodations that helped normalize the status quo. The moral weight of those accommodations is part of what later generations must reckon with. Resistance existed too, and it is important we do not present these processes as unopposed. Saga material and some annalistic fragments speak of retaliatory raids aimed at reclaiming captives, and certain named figures in later narrative traditions are celebrated for freeing prisoners or exacting revenge on slavers. One frequently cited persona, Gunhild, is portrayed in later Icelandic and Norse narratives as a woman associated with fierce opposition and punitive expeditions. Her historicity and the precise attribution of deeds are debated. Designate as indefinido, pending verification. Whether literal or legendary, these stories indicate that contemporaries recognized the particular horror of captive-taking and sometimes organized responses that aimed to recover the disappeared. Local uprisings, negotiated ransoms, and cross-cultural marriages that restored some agency to women and children all formed parts of an uneven, contested landscape of power and rescue. We must always keep our evidential categories clear. Chronicles and annals are documentary sources with their own biases. Monastic chroniclers might emphasize relics and treasures because those things mattered to their patrons. They might underreport the fate of women because their categories of news did not prioritize domestic tragedies. Archaeology is not neutral either. It provides material traces that require interpretation, and different specialists will read the same pit or the same assemblage of artifacts in divergent ways. Scientific techniques, carbon dating, strontium isotope analysis, ancient DNA, add precision, helping to identify movement of people and the timing of events, but they do not by themselves explain motive. The strongest historical case emerges when multiple lines of evidence, documentary, material, biochemical, and contextual, converge to make an interpretation more probable than alternative readings. Why then describe some of these practices as worse than death? The phrase is not a provocation so much as an ethical evaluation, anchored in the effects we can trace. Death is final, but it still allows for memory, naming, burial, and narrative. The practices we have been discussing, systematic bondage, enforced assimilation, the deliberate suppression of voice, dispositional killing designed to prevent later identification, remove those possibilities. They inflict prolonged suffering before death in some cases, but more radically they rob victims of the ability to be recognized in the historical record as persons with names, vows, and communities that could mourn them. For Christian virgins who had taken vows, the theft extended beyond their bodies to their consecrated social identities. To have that identity neutralized, commodified, and finally erased is a layered harm that combines physical violence with spiritual and social obliteration. It is vital to emphasize that not every Viking, not every raid, and not every encounter followed this pattern. We must resist the temptation to assign collective guilt to entire peoples across centuries. The archaeological and textual evidences point to practices that occurred in multiple places and at multiple times, but their distribution was uneven. Local political contexts, individual choices, and the ebb and flow of commerce all mattered. Our task as historians and as citizens is to recover the scale and specificity of suffering without flattening complexity into caricature. There are practical obligations that flow from this recovery. First, continued interdisciplinary research is essential. Many of the strongest claims about ritualized killings, the use of toxicants, breeding practices, are precisely those that require further confirmation through targeted excavation, more comprehensive chemical analysis, and careful re-examination of primary manuscripts. Second, there is an ethical obligation in how we present the past. We must resist sensationalist language and avoid graphic storytelling that re-victimizes. We should give voice to the absent where possible, inscribe these anonymous women into memorializations and scholarly narratives, contextualize their experiences, and ensure that commemorative practices do not erase their dignity. Third, museums, heritage institutions, and academic publishers must work to make both data and interpretation accessible to non-specialists so that public memory does not default to myth. When exhibits, documentaries, or community education programs address this history, they should foreground uncertainty and explain how conclusions are reached, not merely present conjecture as fact. That transparency builds trust and strengthens the moral claim that we remember history to learn from it, not to score rhetorical points. Finally, this history has modern resonances without being an argument about contemporary identities. The structures that monetized human life centuries ago, legal frameworks that permitted ownership, economic incentives that made the buying and selling of people profitable, social practices that normalized dispossession, are not unique to the Viking world. They are the sorts of processes that, in other eras and places, have produced slavery, trafficking, and the stripping away of identity. Remembering how it happened in one place helps us see the warning signs elsewhere. The earth speaks when ink is silent. In the pits, the warehouses, the chemical signatures, we find a different Viking saga, one in which commerce and conquest intersected to produce forms of suffering designed not only to take life, but to erase persons socially and spiritually. That erasure is what allows us to say, with measured prudence, that certain practices inflicted on captured Christian virgins were, in a moral sense, worse than death. They denied a future of testimony, ritual, and belonging that death alone would not necessarily have extinguished. If these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, please like, share, and consult the sources linked in the description. Read critically, ask for the primary reports, and treat the recovery of these lives with solemn respect.